Bonjour. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm so excited to be welcoming everybody to Bannock Banter. So this is our first in a series. Hopefully it will be something that's ongoing. We've got 3 kind of planned over the next several months. And today we're going to focus on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, recognizing the rights of Indigenous children and youth, in part because of this week's celebration by the rights of the child. So I want to spend some time first to acknowledge that UBC and the Human Early Learning Partnership, so HELP, is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and continually occupied homelands of the Musqueam people. I'd invite those of us present, particular helpers, or any of the Aboriginal Steering Committee members to share where they're zooming in from, or add it into the chat. So we have a chat online. And so we're streaming, we're live streaming at Facebook. So please, does anybody want to share and acknowledge the territory they're coming from, apart from Musqueam?
Morning, Kinwa.
Good morning.
Happy to share that I'm on the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nation territory, joining you today in a very rainy day.
Lovely. Do we have others? I know we have some of our ASC members who aren't in Musqueam territory.
Sorry, I was just putting it in chat. I'm a Hitlu. Good morning. Coming to you from the traditional unceded and occupied territories of the 9 allied tribes of the Tsimshian Nation here on the Northwest Coast.
Lovely. That was Duane. So he's a member of our Aboriginal Steering Committee here at HELP. Lovely. Any more? Any more joining?
Good morning. We
I know that voice.
Witaskum, Hupachasad Aksu, from the unsurrendered territory of the Hupachasad people and the shared territory with the Sashat First Nations. Good morning, everybody, and I'm excited to hear from everyone. Masi.
Lovely. That's our Aboriginal Steering Committee member, Witaskum Elder Reanna. Lovely. Okay, well, keep adding into the chats or on Facebook chat where you're zooming in from. And so, yes, I too am right at UBC, and so grateful to be here. Okay, so let's do a quick introduction about the series and even who I am. So I know most of the people who are joining do know me, but for those of you who may not, bonjour, Indigenous, hello, all of my relatives, Makwadodem, so I'm from the Bear Clan. I'm from the communities of Kitigansavi, Anishinaabe, which is a little bit northeast of Agawa, our nation's capital, Ottawa. And I come from a remote community in northwestern Ontario. It's a remote fly-in called Sandy Lake. Hi, Dad, in case you're watching. So first, let me introduce a little bit about HELP. So HELP is a collaborative interdisciplinary research network. We're based at the School of Population and Public Health, and that's within the Faculty of Medicine here at UBC. So in thinking about the past year and moving forward, we've there's a lot of work to be done. There was the Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon report that came out in plain sight. We contributed and supported FNHA's Sacred and Strong, upholding our matriarchal roles, the health and wellness journeys of First Nations women and girls in BC. There's a little part that because I contributed as part of an interview, and there's photos of myself and my daughter included. So very pleased to have been part of that. But it means that there's lots of work to sort of be done. And essentially, we're opening up these conversations to focus on what needs to be done. And so here's part of like the journey. At HELP, I get to participate in so many beautiful conversations where we're really earnest, committed people who are wanting to make a difference and change and looking for multiple ways of doing so. And so I sort of pitched the idea that we could potentially sort of like a bit of a fishbowl while we're doing the journey, share our own experiences and ideally have some of these conversations. So, so welcome to Bannock Banter. I don't know if anybody has Bannock or has prepared some for today. My children, I have 3 teens, so I'm the mother of, so they're Anishinaabe and they're Nuchanoth. So I call them my little Anishinaabes, although, my youngest is 13 and now over 5'11". So, little potentially is not the right word anymore. But my youngest and my oldest, who's 16, Quiet Sikwe, she ended up going, they went to Blue Eagles last night. And they were having bannock and stew. And so I was like, perfect, just right in time for Bannock and Banter. Of course, I was like, where's the bannock? And they ate it all. So I don't have bannock for this morning, unfortunately, which I thought that was going to be my golden, show and tell. It's not. So we have a bit of a recipe that we've shared out. I found it and I loved it because it said it was elder approved. I grew up in the community we had a catering company. And so we made traditional foods. And then we also had contemporary ones too. We had like a pizza van that had like venison pizza, and we did things like that. But one of the things obviously that we did do was bannock. So this isn't the blue sky. This isn't the blue sky recipe, but this is one. So I think if you want to share out the recipe again, we can put it in the chat. And yeah, so it was just from the Calgary Herald, the recipe bannock that is elder approved. So put it in there. Hopefully we'll have more chance. Again, I've been trying to decolonize my diet. And so by virtue of going kind of keto, so I don't necessarily have a keto recipe yet. And we were thinking about also the name of it, but somehow like wild rice and bison and banter didn't have sort of the same ring to it. So here we go. This is our bannock recipe. Okay, so we have basically the setup again, just so you know, we've got about 30 people in our Zoom room that are meeting largely from HELP and our Aboriginal Steering Committee. And then we're live streaming via Facebook to have people, participate. So we've got moderators in both the chats. I'm going to try and keep on top of what people are sharing as well, but looking forward to engaging on both fronts. So feel free to participate if there's questions that come up. We're hoping to have more of a discussion. Again, an hour is not long enough to do this kind of work. So we're hoping to sort of carry it on, and the discussions we're starting now will begin to infuse the work, or continue to infuse the work and its implementation within HELP and the work that we do. Part of, I guess, the role that HELP plays is that we have a number of survey monitoring tools. So we engage with children, parents, and schools to be able to look at the health and wellness all the way from, kids up until youth now. And so we want to make sure that we're doing it in a good way. And so Yeah. I have some of my own slides that I myself am kind of referencing, but it's really an opportunity, like this is meant to be kind of a kitchen sink. So I'm a kitchen sink, a kitchen table kind of conversation. I don't think anybody wants to necessarily hear me drone on about like over the next hour. So please feel free to, share, ask questions, engage and interact. It's meant to be sort of like a 101 on UNDRIP. It is a very important conversation that we're having now at this time. However, as you'll see, it's been going on for the last 4 decades. And so, yeah, I did anybody else want to share before I kind of go into a little bit of a quick overview of UNDRIP? Maybe the work of health and how it relates. Anyone?
Kinwa, I would just like to thank you for leading this and guiding us through these conversations. This is conversations we have been having, but not as an entire organization. And I think you're leading us in a really courageous new direction. So I just want to say thank you and looking forward to this. And please, everyone, at some point, I'm not sure when, jump on video for the chat portion.
Yes, by all means. I mean, definitely. Hopefully this is kind of a simulation of like the ongoing conversations that we're having. It is important that we, sort of set the foundation and the baseline so that people kind of understand where UNDRIP has been, where it is, and where it could potentially go. So again, I do have some slides that I'm not going to be sharing at the kitchen table, but I just to make sure, because there's so much that we don't have time to cover it all, but I thought it would be helpful and a way to kind of set the stage, because we do have some other things that are so key, and the call to action is greater, I think, than it's ever been. And so happy to be offering my own knowledge and sort of resourcefulness too. But any last shares before we jump in?
Well, just thinking about this is Duane, by the way, ASC member. Just thinking about the Article 6 on the is that every Indigenous individual has a right to a nationality, and I go all the way back to the work we did with the EDI. And the when we first started the kindergarten children within that were involved in the EDI, we didn't at that point hadn't even reached 1% in identifying as with or belonging to an Indigenous nation. And then within, I think, 3 years, we brought that to 3.6. And then everything just kept climbing. We just kept going from there. But I remember when we first made these little steps, and people started to call them little steps, and we were at the fall launch, and we had to let people know, yeah, before this point, we hadn't even reached 1%. And I'm pretty sure there's a few more of us out there than that. I said, so, and that was a thing, right? And then the idea too was to not have kindergarten teachers guess as to what nation these children belong to. To work to know. I thought that was important.
As to what?
Yes. Yep. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if you're talking to me, Kinwa,
Yeah.
but also for starting this important discussion. It's Witasco Rianna, the elder for the Aboriginal Steering Committee, and just to let people know that the UNDRIP document was hard work done by many First Nations peoples here in Canada. It wasn't a complete document. As you know, documents go back and forth. As Indigenous people, we didn't get everything that we wanted in this document, but it was a good start. And I think that there's many good recommendations in this document that reflects the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommendations, the murdered and missing Indigenous women, the Truth and Reconciliation, and all of those that all complement each other. And I really commend the help for really pushing forward for many changes within the department. I know, as Duane was saying, that many people have worked hard to work with the Aboriginal Steering Committee to make it really reflect all of the documents and tools that are used that really reflect the rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, families, and communities. It's a good document, and I think if you look at Article 37, and I think this really reflects on all of the recommendations. It says Indigenous people have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements. And point 2, nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of Indigenous people contained in treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements. And I think if people do that in their everyday life, to honor all of those things that are reflected in the declaration, I think we would be much further ahead than we would like to be right now. So I just wanted to say that although it is a good document, there are many things as Indigenous, and at that time it was reflecting First Nations. It was before Canada included the Métis and Inuit people into that, to include Indigenous. But I think that it's a good start. And Messi again, to help for always being open and honoring us as Indigenous people for our treaties, our agreements, and other arrangements that have been made through the Canadian government, and to always put that forward, to put those rights. If everybody is repeating and using the same language, then I think we will move forward much faster. So Masti.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rianna, for starting off in such a good way. It is so important to just acknowledge that, yes, the work that HELP does from year to year, when we survey children across the province, I mean, it can go from anywhere from 11 to over 20% of the kids who self-identify as Indigenous. And so it is really important that we're doing this, and we're doing it a good way to ensure that the children, like Duane said, are able to identify their nations, how they want to be represented in the use of the language, the orthography, as well as reporting back on the languages. So this year we really worked hard, and I want to say thanks again to everybody at HELP, because it was a huge effort to be able to include all First Nations in their own language, self-represented, and then all the Inuit, Nunangut communities, and as well as Métis. So looking at sort of the Métis, both the settlements and the ancestral Métis settlements and communities, so that there's the potential for those children to be able to self-identify in not just one, but both contexts if they have multiple lineages that they would like to do. So that was a big overhaul to be able to do. Okay, so let me jump quickly into this, because I think then the other conversation that sort of Rianna started a little bit was also the context. So I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Victoria. I work primarily in Indigenous law. And so I'm just going to sort of set the framework of how I like to conceive where human rights sort of fit within the Indigenous law lens. So it's going to be a little bit of fun because I do believe that research can be, can be associated with the F word, F-U-N. All right, okay. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I'll do a quick overview and we'll jump into a little bit of the history, and that'll set the context for where I hope we'll begin to imagine. So the General Assembly adopted by majority 144 states in favor. There were 4 votes against. That was Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the States. And then there were 11 abstentions. So this was adopted by the General Assembly on September 13th, 2007. So I'm hoping that people can go back to that time. I don't know if there's anybody in their memory who can think of what happened during 2007, how old you were. I think it's really important to sort of ground that in our own experiences. I'll be sharing my own as we go along. But yes, 2007 is officially when the UN adopted it. The 4 countries that voted against reversed their position, of course, now support the UN Declaration. So for Canada, this was November of 2010. That's our conservative government at the time publicly reversed its position. But it wasn't until May of 2016, so not a super long time ago, that the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Carolyn Bennett, officially removed Canada's objector status to UNDRIP at the UN. So between 2016 and today, as we go along, I think that shows sort of a little bit of progress has been made in that time. It still remains right now the most comprehensive human rights instruments on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is great because, as you'll hear, it's taken about 4 decades. Essentially, part of the work is it established a universal framework of minimum standards. So again, minimum of survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world, and elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to specific situations of Indigenous peoples. So how I think that, if I taught at UBC, and, when I'm trying to relate this notion, I don't know if there are anybody, or if there are anybody out there who loves to watch any of the Marvel movies. Are you guys familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe? So I'm going to relate a little bit the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how it relates to Indigenous worldview, or maybe the Indigenous Cinematic Universe, if we wanted to have that. So I hope this isn't a spoiler alert, but you can go back and please feel free to watch Captain America with a new lens, a new Indigenous worldview. Captain America Civil War in 2016. So we were just talking about 2016. I don't know if this is going to be a coincidence or not. But basically, like, the whole premise, if you're not familiar, let me catch you up. I also had to speak to my 15-year-old son today just to make sure, because I said, where are the other 2 Avengers, right? Hulk and Thor. Anyways, basically the premise of the plot is that there's a political involvement in the Avengers affair, which causes a rift between Captain America and Iron Man. So at this time, like, people are fearing the actions of these superheroes. So the government decides to push for the Hero Registration Act, a law that will limit a hero's actions. So the result is a division in the Avengers. Spoiler alert. Okay, so Iron Man stands with the act, claiming that their actions must be kept in check, otherwise cities will continue to be destroyed. But Captain America, who we love, feels that saving the world is daring enough and that they cannot rely on the government to protect the world. They need to remain free, or they have to choose to remain free or be registered with the government and face regulation and oversight. So this essentially escalates in an all-out war between Team Iron Man, right, Black Panther, Vision, Black Widow, War Machine, Spider-Man, and Team Captain America, Bucky Barnes, Falcon, Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, and Ant-Man. So Thor and the Hulk they've been trapped. So they're not in this one. But basically at the UN gathering where regulations are being worked out, there's an explosion and some people are killed, including the king of Wakanda forever. So basically, when I think about sort of the context of this Marvel Cinematic Universe, you can see that there are these worlds that exist, but they come into connection and relation with other forms of laws and regulations. You have the UN in this case, trying to push forward the Hero Registration Act. I remember, I don't know if you guys remember in Black Panther, where they kind of like fly in and they're landing and they've got to go through this kind of invisible facade to get into Wakanda. I remember when I was 16, going back to because I grew up primarily outside of Ottawa, but to go back to visit my dad, and you fly in and it's like there's nothing but forest, and you fly in and there's like a little landing strip, and you sort of land and there's the community. And I remember thinking, wow, this is so amazing that we have these isolated, because up until then I had, gone to many, many reserves, but never one that was like a remote fly-in. And so within that world is our community, completely isolated. Of course, we interact, we have TV, we have Winter Road to bring things in, we have the Northern Store, so we have this engagement, but at the same time, in those spaces, that's where there are a whole universe of, in this case, Anishinaabe, laws, protocols, ways of being, natural, supernatural, and the same, that's essentially where I like to work. I come from, on my mother's side, a really long line. So Bear Clan, I introduced myself as Bear Clan. Bear Clan are known as the protectors. They tend to be, the lawyers, the police. I work with both. Ways to protect and provide order. And so basically, I come from a long line of medicine women as well, and they had many different powers. And so when I think to the connection to our Anishinaabe community, the potential of that world, the Anishinaabe Cinematic Universe, within that, there are our own laws, our own stories, our own origin stories, the laws that we are embedding and empowering, the stories, the culture, the powers, and ways that we are choosing at this time to strengthen and empower our communities, honor our relations, and move forward. And so they all come into, if you had a Venn diagram, they all come into contact and interact with, like I said, modern day, the Indian Act, federal government legislation. They interact with provincial legislation. They interact with the human rights. So if there's another Venn diagram, it would be up here. And so we get to talk a little bit. So here's the Anishinaabe worldview. Here is human rights, cinematic universe. We're going to put this one in there. We're all interacting, and yet it's so important to know. So we've been having these conversations at HELP about being colonized in different ways. And I remember the first time I realized, oh, how colonized I am. I mean, there's many times, but like this is one that I thought was, sometimes you got to get out of your box in order to see the box. So I traveled down for my last year of law school, like undergrad. I traveled down to Aotearoa, and I was able to work with the different Maori organization. I got to, understand a little bit more about the Waitangi Tribunal and the seabed foreshore. That was kind of going on. There was issues. So I got to travel and speak to everybody and learn. But one of the big things that I got to share was on my my Indian status card. And when I would show any Maori person, because it would come up, any Maori person, my Indian status card, they thought it was hilarious. It was so funny to them that the Canadian government would give me like a card itself that said, Kinwa is an Indian according to the Indian Act, right? Like they thought it was hilarious, in part because they don't have that, and they were like, who's the government to tell me that I'm Maori? Like it was so funny. So it would be like we would go anywhere, it didn't matter where it was, they were like, pull your card, and they thought it was so funny. It was anyway, that's all I did was just flash my status card just to show. I thought it was really it was one point that I thought, oh, wow, yeah, we have been colonized in very different ways. Anyway, anybody want to share before I go on? Do people understand this notion that there are, people sometimes think about it, right? Like, oh yes, that community or that nation has their own. But I think if you help to envision, I know when I have to go talk to Elder Doris and I have to cross the threshold to Musqueam here, at different times there's barricades, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm coming to visit Elder Doris. And they'll wave me through. But, it really is, if if you were traveling into community, that you are going into a different sort of universe with their own. So I think it's very helpful to be thinking in that. And what we're talking about today is, again, a different form of rights and laws that are associated with human rights that are kind of being sprinkled through, right? So, Duane.
I'm back. I just had this conversation with my Uncle Michael just this morning because he called me to talk about what was going on in with the Unistothan, and he wanted clarification. He had a pretty good understanding. My Uncle Michael, a prime educator, he was like the first president of RRU, of Royal Roads, and so. But he called me to get clarification on what's going on and the hip that they're on, and why this group. And of course, what the news is talking about with it. And he says, I'm kind of picking up that the news isn't actually telling everything. And I said, good. I said, because you got to remember that's all coming from a North American cast. And so I told him, I said, well, the thing is, I said, where they're sitting, where that group is sitting is their traditional stewardship. I said, and so even if there are people within their nation that disagree with it, they actually can't determine and tell them that they can't do this, because that's their traditional line, that's their traditional stewardship, and so it's really something, because having people that are, well, I hate to say the word educated in First Nation studies and stuff like that, basically the kind of watered down history lesson that's been taught. It's really hard for them to understand that, because they're still coming from that same mindset of North American understanding. And that's the difference between, once again, is we have to remember there's a difference between acceptance of a distinct culture, and knowing and being. are completely different things. And that was a conversation we had this morning, and it was really cool. We had a really good, we went back and forth on it. He's got some really close Indigenous friends, and yeah, it's cool because the allies are starting to question this now. The allies, although they are allies and they like to be on our side and things like that, but they are still coming from that mindset. And so I'm finding more and more, I'm fielding more and more phone calls now and more emails and saying, no, I get it, man. I can explain it to you if you like. So the same thing with the CN blockades in New Hazelton. Well, that was one house, right? That was just one house that was doing that because that's their traditional stewardship. But if things go south with that one house, then the rest of the houses and the rest of the nation have to have a conversation and say, yeah, what are we going to do about this? So, but we can stand back and say, and that house can do what they want to do on their stewardship. So, yeah, that's a conversation I had this morning.
Love that. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. That's the more stories that get to be kind of animated, right? And so, I mean, I'm using the example of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The more that they can be animated through a story, through like I would love. I have such deep stories that would put Marvel and Pixar to sort of shame, Disney to shame. Like we would have so I hope that in future our children get to really work on that. And not to say that we already are, but the more stories that are able to sort of understand and create a future that and Indigenous people within each of their own communities can live a life that's sort of thriving and enables them to live laws the way that they want to, right? So this is ultimately leading to sort of self-determination. Again, that's a concept that is sort of based in liberal human rights. Like we exist, there are different notions of what that sort of means. Okay, so just quickly going back, because we were talking a little bit about timeline, and so basically how this came to be. When you go back to the origins, we're thinking about 1982. So 1982 is when a working group on Indigenous populations was established as a result of a research study. So this is how it all began. The origin story is based in a research study that was by Jose Martinez Cobo, and he was looking at the problems of discrimination by Indigenous people, so oppression, marginalization, and exploitation, which is ultimately what starts. So 1982, how old were people? Anything that kind of, feel free to put that in the chat. I myself was 3 years old. And so we're talking about essentially 4 decades, right? So between 82 and 1994, so if people remember, the Oka crisis happened in, is it 1990? And so my cousin, I think of like the world, I have family that is from that territory. And my cousin came to visit me a couple of years ago. And he said to me, when we were talking about, visiting communities and work and business, and he said, he's like, you gotta get sovereign. So whenever I have that in the back of my mind, if I'm coming from a place of being two within the other spheres, he reminds me. And his father was one of the warriors in Oka who unfortunately took his life because of the trauma. People don't talk a lot about that, but the land that they got back, he was able to give to his son, and his son has thrived and flourished. And has built housing for his community. So he's got his own unit and like housing unit that he rents out. And so, yeah, so for him to come and be like, you need to get sovereign. So I always hear his words sometimes when I'm talking. But yes, so from 1982 to 1994, the working the working group finally submitted a first draft of the declaration to the subcommission on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities. So that was 92. So sorry, that was 94. So 94, the draft was sent for consideration to then the UN Commission on Human Rights. So at this point, Kinwa, yes, I'm talking in the third person. Kinwa was 15, right? I'm the age of my son now, right? So this is when the first draft. Anybody? Do we have anybody who's fearless enough to put into the chat? How old were they? What were they doing in 1984 when the first draft was sent to the UN Commission? Any thoughts? Oh, our director, Reanna got married that year. So I think it's so important to grasp just the timeline of how long it took. Anybody else? Some people finish university. Okay, well, think on it, because basically from that point, so at the time, of course, states expressed concerns over some of the core provisions, which fast forward to 3 decades later, yes, still ongoing. Yes, the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, obviously, the control over natural resources, surprise, surprise, existing on Indigenous peoples' lands, big focal points. 1995, there was an open-ended intersessional working group that was created, and they elaborated on the 1994, so like a year later. So again, 16-year-old Kinwa. I love all the comments. Some people haven't been born yet. Others are climbing trees and scraping their knees. Love that, Tony. Okay, so we're basically then 16. So at that time, they were hoping the declaration could be adopted by the General Assembly within, and people might remember this, I forgot this, so in doing my research, I remembered the first International Decade on the world's Indigenous Peoples. So that ran from 1995 to 2004. So they were hoping that this would be adopted during that time. So that was during, well, I was 16 to 25. So a lot for me happened. I had moved out to the West Coast. I started at Pearson College. I went to an international college. I traveled, I started at UBC, technically my first year, what year was that? 1998. So I got at the turn of the century, you guys. So 1998, to see and be witnessed, even now, when reflecting back, so much has changed. Not just the buildings that have gone up, but even like acknowledging the relationship to Musqueam. We couldn't say a land acknowledgement up until several years ago. There's been a number of shifts that have definitely occurred within, as an institution, of course, we could all say that, but the university itself. I had traveled to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and back. Something that was kind of interesting. I remember, so in my last year of my undergrad, I was on the Harvard Model United Nations team, and we went. And so we went to discuss like the Model UN. So at that time, we were discussing all of these issues. So again, this was, and I still make the mistake sometimes to call it the draft declaration, because for almost 2 decades, that's what we were calling it. So it didn't happen. It didn't happen during that International Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the first one. So they extended the mandate of the working group, and they created the second International Decade of the World's of Indigenous Peoples. And that went from 2005 to 2015. So this is a very big period of my life as well. I became a mom, I had the 3 kids, so 26 to 36. At this point, I've been in law. Oh, I wanted to say too that before going into law, I had surveyed, that's the kind of research I am. I had surveyed 20 different Indigenous lawyers or lawyers working in Aboriginal law, and asked them like if they had any advice. And I remember a certain lawyer told me that I needed to prepare my career for a career in failure. And so I definitely went into law with very open eyes, but that was a very much like a very stark reality. There's a couple of key things that happened at that time as well. Delgamuuk, there's some main cases that sort of occurred. But yeah, I don't know if people wanted to share a little bit about that period of time and if they remember the decade or the decades and what was going on. I know Reanna shared a little bit earlier, but happy to hear more if you were connected in any way. 1995 to 2015, a lot of work happening in that United Nations draft declaration time. Rihanna?
Well, as being as old as I am, I have seen many, many of these changes that you have been talking about and have been on the fringe of the declaration. My sister, Dr. Judith Sayers, was very much involved in the 90s. A good friend of mine, Sharon Ben, was also involved. Martinez, his big long name, was very much a part of my life, about hearing about him and hearing about all of the places that he went into. And what I remember about him is how he listened and how he heard what the people were saying, and was reflected in a lot of the work that came out with the UN Declaration. I can remember during OCA that I led a group of people that we took over the Indian Affairs Office in Yellowknife and to stand with the people of OCA. And all of the things the other day when I was reading about Edmonton and how they were protesting, or not protesting, they were standing up for the rights of Indigenous people. And thinking about how many protests I walked over that high level bridge when I lived in Edmonton. So my whole lifespan has been all of these things that you're talking about. And coming to this point now, when I was listening to Duane and talking about, our hereditary system and how the hereditary chiefs were the ones that were responsible for the land, for the water, for the forests, for all of the things that affected. And it wasn't until we got our, what they call the Indian Affairs Chief, that the government really came in and got rid of a lot of our hereditary chiefs. And then actually in the Maynooth Treaty, which is on the very west coast of Vancouver Island here, they do not recognize the hereditary system whatsoever. So in those negotiations, they do away with things. The government does away with things that get in their way of pipelines, that get in the way of water rights, our air rights, the rights to go into log our old growth. So it's in my whole lifespan, I've seen kind of many changes and many things that were really big in my life, and changes. Like I said, I was on the fringe of, my husband doing the international work that he does with climate change, and kind of always having that little bit of hope that things are changing, and then things are moving towards more recognition and understanding of like Kinwa, you were talking about, like the different realms within our reserve, as they call them. You know, like when you were talking about showing your status card, I was thinking about like not even being able to leave the reserve without a letter from the Indian agent to say we were allowed to go buy groceries, or we were allowed to do this, and we had 2 hours to go and come back. So all of those things that we were not even allowed to gather to talk about things, to talk about language and culture and traditions. And how this story, I always remember that my aunt would laugh. My aunts would laugh and laugh, and they'd say there was a church up on the Sechot Reserve, and that's where they would go and meet. And one of the guys would be looking out the window and looking for the Indian agent. And when they saw the Indian agent come, they'd all start singing "Onward Christian Soldiers." And my aunts would laugh and laugh and laugh. We weren't even allowed to gather to talk about things that really, those pockets, the spiritual people, the medicine people, the hunters, the fishers, and all of those people were not allowed to gather to even talk about those basic things in our lives. So when you're talking, Kinwa, my mind is going, oh yeah, you know, by that time I had 2 kids, and, you know, like, and we would be, you know, like I would take them in our marches about education as our right, and all of those things that have happened. And even though many people didn't feel that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was, like you were saying, Kinwa, they were the basic human rights. They didn't really expand into the amazing world of Indigenous people, which I think was a real loss. But it is always like a starting point. It's always something that everybody, not just First Nations people, not just Métis people or Inuit people, it's everybody needs to be pushing those that even though it's not being in place, but in their workplace, you know, pushing to eliminate the systemic racism within the institution, and for the recognition always of whose land that we are on, and honoring the treaties and agreements that are in there. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. So Masi.
Anybody else biting? Wanting to weigh in?
I really appreciate your words and the history from both you, Kinwa, and Rianna. It's just so so helpful in so many ways. And I think I reflect on my time at HELP. It's been 14 years at HELP, and I have seen a lot of movement, and in that time. And so as someone is sort of in the colonial system at the university, you know, I sometimes feel very hopeful at what I'm seeing. But I might put you on the spot. Like, should we be feeling hopeful? I mean, recognizing there is a lot of work to do, but we are now having these conversations on Facebook, and, you know, things are moving forward. I mean, is there hope here?
I think I see Duane. Duane's ready to go to answer that question. I will share my response as well. So
as everybody knows, I never step outside of my culture, and at any given time, when questions like that come up, and I embrace Hummingbird, which is your ability to do something that you're just not supposed to be able to do. And there's always hope. Always. I'm always hopeful. I'm hopeful because I have people like you in my life, Amy, and that gives me hope. And the people in my HELP family, and that's where my hope comes from, is my community and my circle. And because there's healing there, and because there's caring there, and it's communal, And that's why when I tell people, that's what I mean when I say I never step outside of my culture, because it's very difficult. You will find it if you really go looking for it, but I don't have to go looking for it because I carry my circle with me everywhere. And as to what Rianna was talking about is, I just started a new position as the Indigenous Relations Associate at the Prince Rupert Port Authority here in Prince Rupert. And one of the things they asked me to do was look at their Indigenous peoples awareness training, and I did, and it was a ton of work. And so I went around to talk to people that put together, and I said, brilliant, fantastic work, fantastic research. And they said, what's missing? And I said, knowing and being. That's what's missing. I said, it's a history lesson, and it's an important history lesson. And this one, not as watered down. It was Indigenous Nations people giving it, and they were very, very straight to the point as to what's been done and what's happened. And so, but that's really what it comes down to, is knowing and being. And is there hope? Absolutely. I wouldn't. My culture doesn't allow me to think otherwise. So.
Thank you,
Yes,
Duane.
thank you. Thank you. That's exactly, I mean, of course, we work in the realm of advocacy and help, for children and families, right? And so that's where, to me, the center, the focus, you can get everybody on board. Everybody wants to see children, communities that are happy, healthy, and thriving. And so how we get there, it can be, in so many different ways, so many ways to support. And I think that's where I started out about being an Indigenous law. We have those, governance systems that need to be empowered, because maybe they've been disempowered, or they continue to have ways of, there's always interaction. And so I liked Duane's example of you're always walking. There is an Anishinaabe circle around me, even though I've come with sacred feet to Musqueam territory. It's always here. We're always carrying it. And so we're always looking for ways. And the more people, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that you can stand in support and allyship to help create space, hold up, strengthen communities, businesses, the better that we will all be, and ultimately our children. So I think we have an hour. Did we just set out an hour? It's like, where did it go?
We are at time officially. I'm not sure how much longer everyone would like to stay on, but I'm willing to stay and learn and listen. Okay.
Well, basically we only got to 2006. And so, 2006 kind of concluded. That's when it was officially adopted. I had mentioned, of course, that, as a result of sort of the 2 decades of consultation and dialogue amongst governments and Indigenous peoples. At that time, there were potentially 370 million Indigenous peoples. And so over the next several years, we go into the transition of, actually just fairly recently, with the adoption of the declaration here in BC. So we have BC legislation now that will help ultimately guide ongoing work to support children and families. And of course, it was adopted in Canada this year as well. And so I feel very hopeful in what's to come. There potentially is more money, more funding, more support to align laws. I think, there's so much more. We have another couple of sessions coming up. We're starting here. It'll be an ongoing conversation. Next time we're talking about the truth and reconciliation, the calls to action. I think we have a little bit of a slide and some resources. So I just put in particular the BC ones because I'm presuming that most of us are here locally within the province, but please have a look at those. And what else do we have? Yeah, so you can have a look at the declaration, and there's some FAQs, and essentially the action, there's a draft action plan that's being discussed and looked at by people, Indigenous peoples in the province, around how to proceed forward. So I am hopeful and looking forward to that. We have 2 new sessions in the new year. Like I said, Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and actioning the calls. Perhaps I will relate it to Harry Potter. And then on March 10th, we've got the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus, and looking at the calls for justice. So in reclaiming power in place, how are we going to action those calls? And so, you know, I try and bring to the work a sense of empowerment. I feel empowered to go and create change and impact. We can't stay in you know, in that sense of oppression. We have to move between states of being. And so the more that we get to be in these empowered states to create those changes and, you know, create thriving communities for us, I think the better it is. And to be able to ensure that First Nations and Métis and Inuit peoples have space to be able to inhabit their own universe, you know, and it, yes, it comes interacted within all of our realms, but the more that we're able to create the space so that they're able to further develop their own, that would be great. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining. Sorry, we're running a little bit late, but we'll have this resource on our website. If you're hoping to join or watch or had to step out, you can catch the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Kinwa. Thank you so much, Duane and Elder Reanna. We really appreciate you being on the call and sharing and contributing to this. And it's so exciting to have everyone here on the call and all the people on Facebook, and just be able to showcase, you know, some of the thinking and the work that we're doing as an organization. So we really appreciate that. Looking forward to the next one. We might have to book it for an hour and a half.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone. Take care. We've recorded the session, and we'll have all the resources up on the help website as a little overview, and looking forward to the next one. Watch for that registration. Thank you again, Kinwa. This was great. Bye, everybody.
Jimmy Wedge.